Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to continue on with our reading and commentary of Answer to Job, and I guess we can just proceed. What Jung comments at the end of paragraph 595 is that in that paragraph, he notes that mortal man has been raised by his moral behavior above the stars in heaven. And what happens is that Job realizes that, notwithstanding the old story that man was made in God's image, God was a pretty dim fellow, because he was taking hundreds of millions of years to make something like man, and certainly all the other very complex creatures we have on the planet. And Job has been shown by God what is called the abysmal world of shards, which basically is saying, well, I kept trying this, that, and the other thing, and some things worked and some things didn't, but here you are. And this is what went into it. And so anyway, that's where we are. And I'll now continue. And that at the end of the last time, I showed William Blake's etching of God showing Job the shards. Okay, so going on then, paragraph 596. Does Job know what he has seen? If he does, he is astute or canny enough not to betray it, but his words speak volumes. Quote, I know that thou canst do all things, and that no purpose of thine can be thwarted. Okay, so he's telling God, yeah, I got it. You can do everything, and you're omniscient and omnipresent, et cetera, and he doesn't call God out per se. So reading on, paragraph 597. Truly, Yahweh can do all things and permits himself all things without batting an eyelid. With brazen countenance, he can project his shadow side and remain unconscious at man's expense. He can boast of his superior power and enact laws which mean less than air to him. Murder and manslaughter are mere bagatelles, and if the mood takes him, he can play the feudal grand seigneur and generously recompense his bondslave for the havoc wrought in his wheat fields. Quote, so you have lost your sons and daughters? No harm done. I will give you new and better ones. Unquote. So this passage pretty much relates to a passage from the Bhagavad Gita, which I read a couple years back, and you can hear me read it with Kushbu Kantarya. But basically, what Krishna is telling Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, it's a scene where it's a moment, it's a numinous moment before a battle. And so the whole Bhagavad Gita is contained within that moment. And in that moment, Krishna realizes that, okay, people are going to get killed, but we'll give you new ones. And that's the way the Almighty works. And so we see this playing out in Ukraine now, where tens of thousands of people are being killed. And but we also know that with all the women and children going to other countries, that there will be new children and new people to people Ukraine after Putin, who is performing like an unconscious Yahweh right now. After he's defeated, there will be new Ukrainians to take the place of the ones that are lost. And so Yahweh, in what Jung is pointing out, is that Yahweh doesn't give a fig about individual humans. And keep in mind that this is the God as envisioned by the Jews before the time of Christ, 500 years before the time of Christ. So God is realizing that, or Job is realizing at that point that, there's some flaws in this God. And so what we have to remember is that humans created God in our image, not God created humans in his image. Because God, as he's worshipped in all religions, is something that came from the human unconscious. And God certainly exists in that sense, but it's not what you think. Okay, there's no puppeteer up there and no devil down there who's making things happen. It's all happening through us. We're the conduits of God, let's say. All right, so going on. Paragraph 598. Job continues, no doubt with downcast eyes, and in a low voice, quote, "Who is this that hides counsel without insight? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare to me." That's God speaking. It's a subquote. "Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you will declare to me." Unsubquote. I had heard of, and Job then says, "I had heard of thee by the hearing of my ear, but now my eye sees thee. Therefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes," unquote. So basically what's being said here is that Job is realizing that all of these wonderful statements about God punishing New York with Hurricane Sandy and people in the Midwest being punished by tornadoes, all of that is just so much BS from fundamentalist preachers who want to create a fearsome God, a God that one should fear. And we have to fear God, but for different reasons. And so Job is coming to this realization 500 years before Christ, and saying so. Now, the reason the book of Job, it seems to me, has been such a weird thing for most Christians, at least. I can't say about the Jews and the Muslims, but the reason it's such a weird thing to me in my Christian mantle is, why was this going on? Why was God having a bet with Satan? That's pretty strange stuff. And so you can't understand it if you think of God as an all good God who's going to take care of you in all cases. 280 million people were killed by wars in the 20th century. Why would a good God do that? And the answer is that there is no such thing as that good God, except as he's manifested through our behavior. And that's basically what the collective unconscious is. The collective unconscious is gradually within humanity learning better and better how humanity has to survive, what we have to do to survive. And sometimes that means there's a collective over in this corner. You could think of it as a tumor in the body that has to be stopped. And it's not really the average Russian, because they've been deprived of any information. So, once you die, your toe isn't going to know that it's dead for a while, but it won't be its fault either. And so we have to realize what we're talking about here. And Dr. Jung later acknowledged, he pulled the kimono aside and said, well, from his perspective, God is the unconscious. And that means both the individual unconscious and the collective unconscious. The individual unconscious because it's yourself that's guiding you through your life. And the collective unconscious is this gargantuan thing, which is between 7.5 and 8 billion people on the planet. And in some ways, we're very much alike. And gradually, we're getting ground together until man starts to behave in a way that we know the species can survive. And that's a problem, because we now, as human beings, can destroy the planet. And we're on the edge of the abyss right now with this war in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. And so God, in the form of the collective of all the countries that are resisting Vladimir Putin, have to come together and do a surgical procedure to stop Putin from doing his bad things, his murders, because if we don't, then we're going to, as human beings, we're going to live under totalitarianism of one man who is apparently psychotic. And so, if you can imagine that his reason for going to this war is because he wants to recreate the map as it was during the time of the Soviet Union. Oh my God, is that worth all these deaths and all this hardship that's going on in Ukraine? I really don't think so. And so we have to get rid of that part of the body politic, or we're all going to be dragged down into it. And it isn't that that the Russian people are bad people. They simply don't know what's going on in their name. But we do know and can see what's happening, and we need to find a way within the context of the laws we've constructed to bring things together. And it was interesting. Last night I was watching the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, which is a very old film. It was done about 65 years ago, I figured. And, in it, a lot of things are imagined, including the parting of the Red Sea, which is an interesting scene, such as it was 65 years ago. And the Jews of that time came forth with the law, the Ten Commandments, and the imagination of the movie was that the Ten Commandments were written in stone by a flaming lightning bolt. And the reality, most likely, to the extent that these things existed at all, was that it was Moses sitting up there in the mountain for 40 days and chiseling them out of stone, because he was guided by his own God image. And, thank goodness for that, because it developed us as human beings into a certain way of being in the world. Although there are many who deny that or deny behaving in that way, but very often, if we don't behave in that way, then what the Buddhists call karma comes around and gets you. So karma is the Buddhist term for what goes around comes around, and and karma will get you. And so Putin is developing an enormous amount of bad karma, and at some point it can get him. And who knows how much his own henchmen believe in what he's doing. I don't know, but not many, I hope. All right, so let's read on. 599, paragraph 599. This is a little longer paragraph. Shrewdly, Job takes up Yahweh's aggressive words and prostrates himself at his feet, as if he were indeed the defeated antagonist. Guileless as Job's speech sounds, it could just as well be equivocal. He has learned his lesson well and experienced wonderful things which are none too easily grasped. Before he had known Yahweh by the hearing of his ear, but now he has got a taste of his reality, more so even than David, an incisive lesson that had better not be forgotten. Formerly he was naive, dreaming perhaps of a good God or of a benevolent ruler and just judge. He had imagined that a covenant was a legal matter, and that anyone who was party to a contract could insist on his rights as agreed. Okay, so anyone who was party to a contract could insist on his rights as agreed, that God would be faithful and true, or at least just, and, as one could assume from the Ten Commandments, would have some recognition of ethical values, or at least feel committed to his own legal standpoint. But to his horror, he has discovered that Yahweh is not human, but in certain respects, less than human, that he is just what Yahweh himself says of Leviathan, the crocodile, quote, he beholds everything that is high. He is king over all proud beasts. So you can see why fundamentalist preachers and priests of all kinds don't like this book, because it's saying, hey, this isn't an all good God. This is a God that is going to have it his way. And if you attribute things like Hurricane Sandy or the tornadoes, hundreds of tornadoes that we get in the United States every year, if you attribute those to this God, then it's paradoxical. But if you understand that those are just phenomena of nature, and that's not what God really is, then you can realize that that God is something else. God is, all of us in our interaction from the collective, from the unconscious. And so the reason that people who come to the United States become more like Americans than like their original country is exactly that, because as we're together, we become something that is different from those original countries. And so by the time of the third generation, and I have one family like that among my daughters, my grandchildren are Korean American, but you cannot, if you speak to them on the telephone, you can't tell that they're not originally American. They're American in every way. The only difference is that they are, Eurasian in their appearance, but otherwise they're quite American, and every bit as good as anyone else in the country. And so people do become American. That's why it takes at least 5 years to become an American citizen, because during that 5-year time, something unconscious happens, which makes them more American than whatever other nationality they might be. And of course, we have Americans from every national group in the world, and from every ethnic group, from every language group, and they're all Americans, and genuinely so. To me, that's the secret sauce that makes America a very strong country, because we have taken the best from every country. People who are smart enough and clever enough to get out from under something that's not good in their own country and come to America so they'll have freedom to live their lives. Those are pretty smart people typically. And so we get the brains, and the people who stay behind get whatever they get. And sometimes that's not too pretty, as we can see in Russia, because the Russians have no way of discernment, because they're denied information. And, that's a heck of a thing. Okay, going on. Paragraph 600. Unconscious as an animal nature, like all old gods, Yahweh has his animal symbolism with its unmistakable borrowings from the much older theriomorphic gods of Egypt, especially Horus and his 4 sons. Of the four animals of Yahweh, only one has a human face. That is probably Satan, the godfather of man as a spiritual being. Ezekiel's vision attributes three-fourths animal nature and only one-fourth human nature to the animal deity, with the while the upper deity, the one above the sapphire throne, merely had the likeness of a man. This symbolism explains Yahweh's behavior, which from the human point of view is so intolerable. It is the behavior of an unconscious being who cannot be judged morally. Yahweh is a phenomenon, and as Job says, not a man. Okay, so good morning, Brandy. Good morning, mighty man. Welcome. So the point is that Job is realizing that God has an animal nature too, as we do, and we have our instincts and so on, and this is why on all cathedrals you see some of the apostles represented by animals, and theriomorphic, which is the $65,000 word here. Theriomorphic means a god that is an animal god. And so human beings, let's say 5,000 to 2,000 years ago, saw God as a creature. And so in the Ten Commandments, which I was watching last night, the people create a golden calf to worship while Moses is on the mountain. And it's quite an orgy that they're having in the down on the lowlands while Moses is working on his tablets. Down in the lowlands, they're creating this golden calf, and they're having themselves quite an orgy until he comes down and lays down the law about what human beings believe in, or should be believing in. And I'm not saying that the Ten Commandments didn't come from God. Assuredly, they did. They came from God through the modality of Moses. And I'm simply saying that those tablets, which I have no doubt did exist, and the Torah, which the Jews were recognizing even in Moses's day, those surely are divine and divinely inspired, because they created civilization, basically, instead of being a bunch of tribes living out in the desert and getting around. It caused men and women to become civilized in some way. And by creating that set of laws, then people had some guidelines about what their behavior should be. And so that is not a bad development in the history of theology. And of course, then Christ came along, and instead of the law, he sold belief. And belief is, belief in the Christian church is belief in the all-good God. And of course, that has a paradoxical aspect to it, which is, I don't think there's any human being that can say the truth who thinks that the murder of the people at Comatorsk train station yesterday with a rocket, or a missile, I guess, a ballistic missile, I don't think anybody can say that was the work of a all good God. And it was the work of the God of the Russians, in the sense that the Russians who were involved in it were convinced that they were in the right and they should do that. But the rest of us in the world pretty much don't think that, as you can see from the UN and how the UN is voting. And so now we have to get this process stopped somehow. Who knows how that will happen, but we have to get it stopped without destroying our species. And this is the immense challenge that the Biden administration has, which is, we have a psychotic in control of the Russian nation, and most Russians wouldn't decide to do things the way he's doing them, but nonetheless, he has control and he's able to do these things. So that, has to be stopped, unfortunately. Or fortunately, it has to be stopped. And, it's a phenomenon that is not a man, okay? A human being who has two daughters and all that sort of thing, just wouldn't do these things. There's no need for it. If he wants to control Ukraine, he needs to control it by making it realize that it will be better off under his dominance. But he's not convincing anybody of that by what he's doing. And so instead, he's going to either end up dead or he's going to end up in a tribunal, or in the court of public opinion. He will be have plenty of bad karma to worry about. David Solomon says Enantiodromia, and yep, that's a terrific word, David. What is you have to put it in a sentence so we can comment about it. Enantiodromia means the tendency of some things to turn into their opposite. And so if we take the Ukraine war, one day it will be over. And the horrors of this Palm Sunday in Ukraine will become flowers and beauty and light once again. But that doesn't mean that a lot of people won't have to die before that happens. And so, the shortest way to make Enantiodromia happen would be if some of his subordinate leaders were to depose him, which is what happened when the Soviet Union crashed, by the way. When the Soviet Union broke up, I got confused about who did what to who at that time. I wasn't paying much close attention to it, but whoever was the prime minister of Russia at that time was set aside by the people under him because they were afraid that he would do something stupid with nuclear weapons. And obviously those people do understand that their country too would be destroyed if we have a nuclear exchange. And so that can't be allowed anywhere on the planet. And just so you understand, scientists differ on the number, but if 23 to 100 nuclear weapons are used in the atmosphere, then all life on earth will be destroyed. Simple as that. And we see that. We've seen it in the meltdown of Chernobyl back in '86, and how that part of Russia is, or I'm sorry, that part of Ukraine is no longer habitable and won't be for, many tens of thousands of years probably. And, the young Russian soldiers who came into that area didn't know the history. And so they set up camp in Chernobyl, and immediately they're starting to get radiation sickness, and they just had to pull up their tents and pull out. The Ukrainians didn't have to do anything about that. And so, goodness gracious, what a world we have. Okay, paragraph 601. One could, without too much difficulty, impute such a meaning to Job's speech. Be that as it may, Yahweh calmed down at last. The therapeutic measure of unresisting acceptance had proved its value yet again. Nevertheless, Yahweh is still somewhat nervous of Job's friends. They have not spoken of, quote, they have not spoken of me what is right, unquote. The projection of his doubt complex extends, comically enough, one must say, to these respectable and slightly pedantic old gentlemen, as though God knows what depended on what they thought. But the fact that men should think at all, and especially about him, is maddeningly disquieting and ought somehow to be stopped. It is far too much like the sort of thing his vagrant son is always springing on him, thus hitting him in his weakest spot. How often already has he bitterly regretted his unconsidered outburst? Okay, so who was bitterly regretting his considered outburst? Probably both Yahweh and Job. And what Jung is referring to is that his friends come to him and say, oh, well, you must have done something wrong, and that's why God is being nasty to you. So that would be like saying that, some perfectly gentle and respectful people did something wrong, and that's why the train station was destroyed yesterday, because you must have done something wrong that we don't know about, so God is punishing you. No, it doesn't work that way. We all have to look to our own souls and first start behaving the way our God image directs us to behave. And we have to always decide for the good, or we've got big problems. And Dr. Jung often refers to the first epistle of John 4:1, in which he says that you have to examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. And what he means by that is whether they be of God or the devil. Okay, and you have to decide for the good. And this is what is essential in maturity and in individuation. And so you develop an ego that is strong enough to withstand really horrible thoughts, because little children don't understand these things, and so their parents control them until they develop a strong enough ego and a strong enough good behavior so that they can be trusted out in the world. But once they're mature enough, which in the United States we say that's 18, then they need to have their ego be strong enough to withstand terrible thoughts. And sometimes we get people who don't have a strong enough ego, who will succumb to, the worser angels of their soul. They'll basically succumb to Satan, as we say in our shorthand. And we see that in Donald Trump. We see that in Vladimir Putin, and they think that they can get away with something against the rest of us, but really they can't. And this has been known for a very long time. I remember that Mohandas Gandhi, when he was fasting, trying to get people to stop rioting in India, he said, throughout history, there have been tyrants, and for a time they can seem very strong, but in the end they always fail. Think of it, always. So they always fail, and humanity needs to find ways to recognize them early enough so that they don't get power, which is what's happened with both Putin and Trump. They get power, and then they're behaving for their own benefit, but they're not behaving for the benefit of their people or society at large or humanity at large. And so someone who's that unconscious can do terrible things. And we have to hope that the people that control our future, who are the Biden administration, of course, but also the leaders of all the free world, we have to hope that we have enough smarts to stop these crazy people before they get into positions of power. And this is why it's always good in the United States to select leaders with a lot of experience, because as they go up in the hierarchy, they display who they are. And if they jump the queue, as Vladimir Putin did, we need to have mechanisms to stop them within their own society. And so far, we're not very good at stopping it in our own society, because that's what we've had since 2016 is a kind of psychic epidemic in the U.S., where these less than mature people who don't understand the consequences of what they do have been supporters of our former president. And ultimately we have to come out of that fog and realize that's not good. So Brandy says the rise and fall of Solomon centers on how a divided heart can destroy a kingdom. Only God's ways result in God's desired outcome. Well, let's say only God's, whose desires, that's the question. And, Solomon, violated the commandment against adultery and wanted to marry Bathsheba. And so he arranged for Uriah to be murdered. Okay, and so he committed 2 violations of the 10 Commandments there. And so, yes, David, okay, he was, so I'm talking about David now, who's comes after Solomon, I believe. But he obviously had a divided heart, although he did some good things like killing Goliath when he was a boy. Brandy says, the one and only God, not the many. Well, the only God who is the result of the selection of the good spirits. In other words, going back to 1 John 4:1, it's a God that's selected by mature individuals, and those mature individuals decide for the good spirit and not the evil spirit. And certainly those old Hebrew kings had their troubles. Solomon didn't know how to solve this problem between the 2 mothers who were claiming one baby. And so he wisely said, well, we'll just split the baby and you can each have half. And the actual mother, the baby, said, no, you can give it to her. And he realized that only the true mother of the baby would make that sacrifice of giving up the child rather than having it killed. And so that was a question of figuring out how you could make the facts and the situation decide the situation properly, because he had no DNA or anything like that to assist him with his choices at that time. And so in terms of, Brandy, in terms of this book, yes, the one and only God, but the one and only God has a dark side, has a shadow. And this is what Dr. Jung pointed out in this book, why he got in so much trouble with the theologians, because the theologians for 2,000 years haven't wanted to admit that God has a dark side. They didn't want to admit it. And so they believed in this concept of privatio boni in Latin, which means the absence of good, privation of good, the privation of good, saying that it doesn't exist, it is shadow. Well, it certainly exists. And by denying that that evil exists, we invited the wars of the 20th century, which killed 280 million people. And so we have to recognize that we always have to decide for our better angels, and we have to recognize that when people are deciding the wrong way, so that they can be stopped early in their career before they gain power. Because as Dr. Jung said, the terrible temptation to power is the dark side of God. And we see it very clearly with Putin. And I've been working on some illuminations to help people understand some of the things that Jung said. And so since it's relevant here, I'll show you. Now, the way I've done these illuminations is like the medieval monks. I'm trying to show you something that's not obvious in the writing. And of course, Dr. Jung's writing is very dense, and so you have to work through it to figure out what he means. And so when you see the text that I'm going to show you, it's basically about a quarter of one paragraph, and the last quarter of one paragraph. And yet it's one of the most profound things that he said in his whole career. And so what I've done, you may know that the advice novelists get is to use every sense on every page. So, put a smell, describe a smell on the page, describe a visual image, describe a sound, describe a feeling or a touch, and describe a taste on every page. And if you do that, you'll have a very rich novel. Well, yes, that's true. But in terms of the psychological functions, you'll only be in the sensing part of the psychological functions, keeping in mind the four functions that Dr. Jung delineated, and which appear in the Myers-Briggs type indicator: sensing versus intuition, and thinking versus feeling. Those are the four functions. But in that advice to a novelist, we've excluded three of the functions. And so what my insight was that you should also include all four functions on every page, and then you'll have something that's extremely rich. And so what I've done is I've taken words that are black and white, and I've converted them into color representing the four functions. So in my work, if it's in green, it's sensing. If it's in purple, although purple looks black almost, but if it's in purple, then it's intuition, or it's God, something that's metaphysical. Sensing is the physical world. Intuition is the metaphysical world, the field of your mind. Then thinking is the logos, it's rationality, and feeling is irrationality, it's emotion. Okay, so having said that, I'll now show you an example that I have been working on, and it sort of covers the issues that we're talking about here. And it appears not in the collected works of C.G. Jung, it appears in Letters, Volume 2, on page 316. So here it is. Man's relation to God probably has to undergo a certain important change. Instead of the propitiation or the propitiating praise to an unpredictable king, or a child's prayer to a loving father, the responsible living and fulfilling of the divine will in us will be our form of worship and commerce with God. His goodness means grace and light. His dark side, the terrible temptation to power. Man has already received so much knowledge that he can destroy his own planet. Let us hope that God's good spirit will guide him in his decision whether God's creation will continue. So as you see here, Dr. Jung is not denying God, not at all, but he's pointing out that God is something different, and that something different is in us, and we're going to be manifesting that. So anyway, that's a little piece of art that I'm working on right now. So let us go back here. So So I'm going to reread paragraph 601. Thank you, Brandy, for your comment. Yeah, there would be no creation story without the shadow per se. Yeah, absolutely, or perceived, because the shadow is in the creation story. So I'm going to reread, if I haven't already done so, paragraph 601. One could, without too much difficulty, impute such a meaning to Job's speech. Be that as it may, Yahweh calmed down at last. The therapeutic measure of unresisting acceptance had proved its value yet again. All right, so Job has prostrated himself before the God as he perceived it. Nevertheless, Yahweh is still somewhat nervous of Job's friends. They have not spoken of me what is right. Okay, quote unquote. They, quote, have not spoken of me what is right, unquote. The projection of his doubt complex extends comically enough, one must say, to these respectable and slightly pedantic old gentlemen, as though God knows what depended on what they thought. But the fact that men should think at all, and especially about him, is maddeningly disquieting and ought somehow to be stopped. It is far too much like the sort of thing his vagrant son is always springing on him, thus hitting him in the weakest spot. How often already has he bitterly regretted his unconsidered outbursts? Okay, so God is regretting his outbursts, and surely you as an individual, whoever you are, have probably regretted something that you said to a parent or a teacher or a friend at some point that was hurtful. And so if we take Will Smith as an example, who slapped Chris Rock, I don't know if they are friends, but surely Will Smith regrets losing control of his emotions and doing that slap on television. Surely he could have settled his score in some way. And although I sympathize with Will Smith, and you never know, the dark side may emerge, and I might well have reacted as Will Smith did in that circumstance. But if you do react in that way, then you have to be prepared for the consequences. And that's what is happening now. And so we can't have as an example to our children that you can just go up and slap somebody. That will lead to violence very quickly if we do that. Okay, so paragraph 602. One can hardly avoid the impression that omniscience is gradually drawing near to a realization and is threatened with an insight that seems to be hedged about with fears of self-destruction. Fortunately, Job's final declaration is so formulated that one can assume with some certainty that for the protagonists, the incident is closed for good and all. Okay, so Job has to mollify this God that's not a man in some way, because if you keep confronting him as we're confronting Vladimir Putin, he'll just get angrier and angrier until he does something that's really hurtful to all of us. And so we have to find a way to get him out of that mode. And that's what I really respect the Biden administration for holding back and, not coming in guns blazing, because if you come in guns blazing, then you're going to have Putin get his other stuff out too. So 603, we, the commenting chorus on the great tragedy, which has never at any time lost its vitality, do not feel quite like that. For our modern sensibilities, it is by no means apparent that with Job's profound obeisance to the majesty of the divine presence and his prudent silence, a real answer has been given to the question raised by the satanic prank of a wager with God. Job has not so much answered as reacted in an adjusted way. In so doing, he displayed remarkable self-discipline, but an unequivocal answer has still to be given. Okay, so Will Smith could have responded in a more equivocal way by doing the shouting at Chris Rock without going up and physically slapping him. And if he had done that, probably nobody would have noticed on the big picture. He might have gotten a slap on the wrist or asked to leave the venue, but the consequence of what he actually did, the Motion Picture Academy had no choice but to punish him because we can't allow famous people to go around slapping one another. Otherwise, that will be a role model for others in the future. And so people have to see that. And so while I am very sympathetic to Will Smith and his wife, I admit that my emotion could get carried away too and be irrational. We have to learn how to control our emotion in such a way that we don't do something like that in front of a couple of billion people, because if you do that and it's not punished, then it becomes a role model. And then we have all kinds of incidents all over the world. And so I acknowledge that the Motion Picture Academy had to do something, and they have done. Thor says, why didn't anyone slap Ricky Gervais 2 years ago? Was what he said true? Well, I don't know. I don't actually remember that particular incident. That was then, and this is now. Okay, so paragraph 604. To take the most obvious thing, what about the moral wrong Job has suffered? Is man so worthless in God's eyes that not even a tort mortal can be inflicted on him? That contradicts the fact that man is desired by Yahweh, and that man is desired by Yahweh, and that he obviously matters to him, whether men speak right of him or not. He needs Job's loyalty, and it means so much to him that he shrinks at nothing in carrying out his test. This attitude attaches an almost divine importance to man, for what else is there in the whole wide world that could mean anything to one who has everything? Yahweh's divided attitude, which on the one hand tramples on human life and happiness without regard, or on the other hand must have man for a partner, puts the latter in an impossible position. At one moment, Yahweh behaves as irrationally as a cataclysm. The next moment, he wants to be loved, honored, worshiped, and praised as just. He reacts irritably to every word that has the faintest suggestion of criticism, while he himself does not care a straw for his own moral code if his actions happen to run counter to its statutes. Okay, so I would love to see the original draft of this, because apparently Jung's secretary, when she was typing it out, said that all the ancient pastors in her upbringing were rebelling as she was printing it out. And apparently there was quite a row within Jung's inner group. And so Jung did tone it down, but this is pretty extreme in its own right, where, he's pointing out that God won't accept any criticism, and he doesn't care about a moral code, which he doesn't, because God, in this case Yahweh, is not a man and has no interests in being a man. And Torres says, I found the slapping to be fake. However, slapping must stop before it escalates to knives and guns and such. Yes, absolutely. And I certainly wondered whether it was a fake deal, but I don't think so. And I don't think that now, anyway. And at first, I thought it might have been a publicity stunt put on by Chris Rock and Will Smith, but in retrospect, and given the reactions of the Academy and so on, it's clear that it was a real thing and shouldn't be made light of. And just as you say, Dor, that if we don't stop it, then it gets worse and worse. And, this is the issue that we have with Ukraine. At some level, we have to stand on the agreements that we have actually entered into. But we have to cool our jets to the extent that if we really enrage this man, Putin, we could destroy the world, and he could destroy Russia as well as the United States. And so we want very, very mature and individuated people in charge of our government, and especially in charge of nuclear weapons, so that things don't get out of control. And, considering the fact that Mr. Biden is facing a lot of criticism for being too soft, I take the opposite position, which is that he's being very hard, very strong, and very mature in the way he's handling the situation. And I think we'll see some interesting results that we will tend to favor over the next year or so. I'm hopeful anyway. And, I get accused of being an optimist, and I am certainly that. So paragraph 605. One can submit to such a God only with fear and trembling, and can try indirectly to propitiate the despot with unctuous praises and ostentatious obedience. But a relationship of trust seems completely out of the question to our modern way of thinking, nor can moral satisfaction be expected from an unconscious nature God of this kind. Nevertheless, Job got his satisfaction without Yahweh's intending it, and possibly without himself knowing it, as the poet would have it appear. Yahweh's allocutions have the unthinking yet nonetheless the transparent purpose of showing Job the brutal power of the demiurge. Quote, "This is I, the creator of all the ungovernable, ruthless forces of nature, which are not subject to any ethical laws. I too am an amoral force of nature, an amoral force, not immoral, but amoral, meaning without any issue of morals, a purely phenomenal personality that cannot see its own back. So the God that sends hurricanes and tornadoes, doesn't really think about what he's doing to human beings or other creatures on planet Earth, because he set things in motion 3.7 billion, 13.7 billion years ago. And those tornadoes are only a consequence of that original setting in motion at the time of the Big Bang, I would say. All right, so paragraph 606. This is, or at any rate could be, a moral satisfaction of the first order for Job, because through this declaration, man, in spite of his impotence, is set up as a judge over God himself. We do not know whether Job realizes this, but we do know from the numerous commentaries on Job that all succeeding ages have overlooked the fact that a kind of moira or decay rules over Yahweh, causing him to give himself away so blatantly. Anyone can see how he unwittingly raises Job by humiliating him in the dust. By so doing, he pronounces judgment on himself and gives man the moral satisfaction whose absence he found so painful in the book of Job. And so the point is that we can rise above even our worser angels, I would say. And so, while God is an amoral force, meaning that when the Big Bang blew up, there wasn't anything like morality in it. And in the natural world, there still isn't, only with the exception of human beings. No other creatures think about morality. And so morality is an invention of human beings, and our unconscious, our God image, and our creative collective unconscious. The fact that Job gets a new family and new sheep and new goats, etc. at the end, and everything is alive, that isn't because God decided that he'd now be kind to Job. It's because if you stick to your guns, things will come around to you. And I don't mean that in a violent way, but by using that phrase. But the point is that if you behave well and understand appropriate behavior and treatment of people, and use your power, your terrible temptation to power, only sparingly, then you're going to have a good life. But if you decide to abuse your power, then it's going to abuse you back ultimately. And so obviously if someone strays from their marriage vows, and then their spouse learns of it, there can be a very violent and negative reaction to that, or there can be a mature reaction which says that, okay, we're going to press on even so. and then the love between those two parties can deepen. And unfortunately, in the United States, at least, where we have a 50% divorce rate, we haven't brought this into consciousness yet, that it's not the end of the world, or it shouldn't be in most cases, and it's much more evil for people to walk away from their marriages and leave children to their own devices to raise themselves in a single family home or single parent home. And so the benefit of staying together is that the children experience a more mature way of being in the world by their parents behaving in a more mature way, I would say. And these things apply to all of us in one way or another. Right. Right. So Taurus says agreement, yes, like the ones Germany and others agreed with Russia not to expand NATO eastward, an agreement that has been violated to the extreme. Yes, it has, because NATO did accept a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries, and that's maybe pushing too far. And now we have to reap the whirlwind. What is that going to cost in the end before all this stops? And Brandy says, we will stand in the image that is rightfully ours once the roots are dug up and we have purged to stand in the glory. God used all things for us to be the image described. Yes, absolutely. And God used all things to create all things in the appropriate image. And one of the interesting aspects of the Red Book is that the first chapter of it is called "The Way of what is to come." And if as modern people, as we look at that title and consider the contents of that chapter, we think that we're going to be informed of some way outside that is going to tell us what the future will be. But that's not true at all, because we are the way, we are the culmination of everything that's come before. And so each and every one of us is the bridge from what was before to what will be, the way of what is to come. We are it. Okay, we are the bridge to the future. And so there's no supreme being that's going to come down and say, well, you got to do it this way. It doesn't work that way. And so we have to understand that each of us has to understand that there's only one way, and that is our way, our individual way. And we first must be acting properly ourselves, and in the way that we deem appropriate. And each of us has to make his own decision, because we're all the result of 3.5 billion years of development of the human species, going back to single-celled organisms. And all of our ancestors have done two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. That's it. They all did that. And they all did it successfully. Both things. They survived until they reproduced. Now, we are the culmination of that. Each one of us is the culmination of that coming along, and each one of us is the culmination of all the clashes that have taken place over history. It's a very bloody history, but if you look outside your window, you'll also see how bloody nature itself is, because all life lives on other life. Everything that you buy in the grocery store was once alive. Everything that you eat was once alive. You can't eat concrete. Okay. And so what we have done as human beings is we've sublimated that fact. We've hidden it from ourselves so that we don't have to face the gory truth that we murder other species in order that we can live. But that's exactly what we do. And even rabbis that are making kosher meat have to work in slaughterhouses, and we've even made that word sublimated by, now we call them packing houses, packing businesses instead of slaughterhouses, but that's what they are, and they're very efficient. And even rabbis have to work in slaughterhouses in order to make kosher meat, and they have to do the killing in a certain way that they think is a divine way. And so, we're all doing that one way or another, whether we admit it or not. At least in the case of the Jews, they admit it and say, okay, we have to kill this creature in a certain way in order to be by God's will. But, oh my God, we all do that. When you go to the meat counter and you see all these cuts of meat, all those cuts of meat were once living creatures, and they've all been slaughtered in some way, whether we follow the Jewish method of doing it. At least they're conscious of it, and most of us are not. Put it out of our minds when we're food shopping, for example. And so it's better if we do realize it and realize the meaning of these things much better. Okay, so going on, paragraph 607. The poet of this drama showed a masterly discretion in ringing down the curtain at the very moment when his hero gave unqualified recognition to the Almighty of the Demiurge, or the almighty power of the Demiurge. Jung writes this 2 words in Greek, and I'm sorry, I don't read Greek except with great difficulty, so I'm not going to do that. But he recognizes the power of the Demiurge by prostrating himself at the feet of his divine master. No other impression was permitted to remain. An unusual scandal was blowing up in the realm of metaphysics, with supposedly devastating consequences, and nobody was ready with a saving formula which would rescue the monotheistic conception of God from disaster. Even in those days, the critical intellect of a Greek could easily have seized on the new addition to Yahweh's biography and used it in his disfavor, as indeed happened, though very much later, so as to mete out to him the fate that had already overtaken the Greek gods. but a relativization of God was utterly unthinkable at that time and remained so for the next 2,000 years. Paragraph 608, the unconscious mind of man sees correctly even when conscious reason is blind and impotent. The drama has been consummated for all eternity. Yahweh's dual nature has been revealed, and somebody or something has seen and registered this fact. Such a revelation, whether it reached man's consciousness or not, could not fail to have far-reaching consequences. So the point is that by the fact of the book of Job, humanity began to realize that the God image had to be changed, or was changing. The image of God was changing. And so Christ came along and gave us the all good God, the summum bonum. But the problem is that if you say God is all good, then you're leaving out his dark side, and you're inviting yourself to be blindsided by evil nature. And so we must be aware that evil is a great power in the world, in humanity, and that we have to find ways to keep that under control. And there's nothing evil in nature per se. I mean, in nature, right outside your window, there is begetting and devouring going on constantly. I know my wife and my mother-in-law love to watch the video cams of osprey and eagles as they go through their annual ritual of creating a family each year. And we're not so different from them. So let me run you through. We're at an end of a part here of answer to Job. So I'm not going to go on with the paragraphs today, but I want to make this point, which is that even today we are not so different from, let's say, the osprey. So the osprey do three things uniquely. They do one thing that we don't do, and that is that they mate for life, for one thing. But the mating ritual is that first, the male osprey has to do a sky dance. He has to get the attention of the female by doing something flamboyant. And so men traditionally have done it in the human species by making themselves appear to be heroes by wearing fancy uniforms if they're in the military, or by showing off in some other way. And so human beings get the attention of human males get the attention of women by doing something that's noteworthy, that woman cares about, number one. Number two, the male in the osprey community has to bring a fish. Now, the reason for that, obviously, is that during the 40 days that it takes to lay and incubate the eggs, the female can't really fend for herself. So the male has to tell the female by means of bringing the fish in that he can take care of her while she's incapacitated by taking care of the babies. And the third thing he has to do is he has to build a nest. And it's rather comical to watch these webcams because the way it works is the male brings in a stick to go into the nest, and the female either accepts it or she doesn't. She says something like, you expect me to sit on that for 40 days? And she'll throw it over the side of the platform on which they're building their nest. And then he'll have to bring another stick. And it's only after time of trial and error that finally the male brings in things that make it comfortable for the female to then lay her eggs and incubate the babies. But they do it every year, and it's the same osprey every year. So they fly 5,000 miles. In the case of those that are around where I live, they fly 5,000 miles down to Brazil and spend the winter down there because it's too cold here in the wintertime. But then in the spring, and it happens almost like clockwork around St. Patrick's Day, the male shows up and he waits for the female, and he just sits on the platform that they've used every year. He comes back to the same platform every year. And the female has been off living her life for the last 6 months. They haven't been together. But when they're mating, they are together, and they are, they are monogamous. So the male comes back and he has to wait and see if the female actually survives over the winter and so on. Obviously, these birds could be killed by hunters or natural disaster or whatever, but in most cases, the same female will show up at the same nest every year. And as soon as she arrives, then they begin this process of fishing and building the nest. And so if we look at the human species now, we are not so different. Okay, we traditionally the male takes the woman out to dinner, and that's a demonstration that he can feed her, feed the woman, and if he takes her to a fancy restaurant, that could be considered like a sky dance. She can be impressed, and if he dresses in good clothes, I mean, I see this, there's an advertisement on television about this guy who's wearing this gray t-shirt and it's all stretched out, and he's just doesn't have himself put together, and you say, how can that kid think that this woman would be interested in him? Because he's just slovenly. And the truth is, you have to dress for success and let the woman see that you not only, one, respect her, but two, respect traditions of the community, and that you're going to be a good provider. And then obviously there has to be the provision of a place to live with this family that you want to create. So the traditions of the osprey, the sky dance, the bringing of the fish, and the making of the nest, is really instinctually the same things that human beings do to this day. You can think about the idea of having free sex, and we can do anything we want, and there are consequences. Obviously, there's consequence of sexually transmitted diseases, and there are all kinds of consequences if you don't stick to the traditional ritual, because the traditional ritual is what has worked for humanity for many years, millennia. And so now we've turned our back on that in a way that we think we can just go out every night and maybe have a one night stand with a different woman every night or a different man. And there are consequences to that. And so we have to reconsider our attitudes about these things. Not to say that they should be prohibited. No, we shouldn't prohibit them. But we can raise to consciousness and reflect upon what they represent. The osprey, for very good reason, don't go around trying to mate with another osprey female, for example, because what will happen if you do that, then you're very likely to have another osprey male attacking you from the heavens. And so, that can't last very long. And we have to bring ourselves to consciousness and realize that, and then understand that these are our instinctual roles, that every woman should demand it and every man should demand it. A man shouldn't spend time with a woman who's having many men. And in the old days, if that happened in the royal realms, the woman would lose her head. Because at the same time, no man wants to be raising somebody else's child. They want to be raising their own child. And so, women should demand that when a man wants to go out with her, that he dresses properly and respectfully, that he covers the cost of dinner, ideally. I mean, if you want to just for fun with friends, for social reasons, go Dutch treat, that's all well and good. But if you're in the mating dance, then the woman has to show that, or the man has to show that he can support the woman during the time, during the child raising period at the minimum. And you have to be gentle with one another, really do, because if you don't be gentle with one another and loving with one another, then you can also drive your spouse away, which is what happened to me. And then you can lose your marriage. And finally, the man has to be able to provide lodging during the childbearing years at the very minimum. And if that in any way is not going to happen, then move on, find another, because that individual is not going to be the one that you need to have as a spouse. And men need to realize this responsibility too, that certainly during the childbearing years, you have to make this possible. Now, women want to believe that everything is equal, but it's not. It's not equal. Only women can reproduce the species. And at least during that 20 or 30 year childbearing period, women have an extra responsibility and an extra difficulty that men don't have, and they have to recognize that and recognize what it takes to raise a family. And it doesn't mean that a woman also cannot achieve the ultimate in the job market. And, you know, our new Supreme Court justice is a living proof of that. But both men and women have to understand the responsibility to their children, and that's a big deal. Okay, so none of my panelists have shown up today, so I've been responsible for a hour and 45-minute soliloquy here. Okay, so Brandy says, we will stand in the image that is rightfully ours once the roots are dug up and we have purged to stand in the glory. Yes. And God used all things for us to be the image described. Absolutely. And so anyway, we are the bridge. It's important for us to remember that the way of what is to come, the future of humanity, depends on each and every one of us. We are the bridge, and we are the hopes and the fears of all of our ancestors going back 3.5 billion years. And we have hopes and fears for our children. And when they come along, they start becoming the bridge. But during our lifetimes, we are the bridge of what will come in the world, in our society, and we all have to take responsibility for that. That's what individuation is. And this is the point that Dr. Jung was making throughout, although in a very turgid manner, so it's difficult to realize what he was saying sometimes, and that's why I'm doing this every 3 times a week, trying to interpret what Dr. Jung was saying, so that you can reflect on it yourself and make your own decision about whether I'm right or not. But anyway, so happy Palm Sunday. If you're a Christian, I wish you well. And let us hope that the world becomes a better place, and that we don't get destroyed by our own stupidity, which surely